Well, hey friends, welcome back to another slab pottery tutorial. Today we are tackling the long-awaited butter dish. This was a project that was requested for quite a while, and I'm so happy to have it for you today. It took a little longer than usual because I wanted to be sure to accommodate at least 2 different butter dish sizes. So I do have a quote-unquote European size, which is also similar to the West Coast American butter size, and also the standard American butter size, the stick size. But I do think that these sizes can apply to a lot of butter around the world. Who knew that making a butter dish would be so complicated? But I'm going to get more into the sizes later. Here you can see I'm already getting into the tutorial, so let's talk about it. So what you've seen so far is I've just cut out each piece that I'm going to be using, the pieces that correspond to the European size butter dish that I'm going to be demonstrating here. However, the steps are exactly the same if you choose the American size. So I cut out the pieces and I rolled out a slab. You want to be working with a 1/2 centimeter slab here. Once the slab is rolled out, you want to just set your template pieces onto the slab, line them up so that you can cut out one of each piece with the exception of the butter dish side. So for the European butter dish, that is K10, and for the US, that's K13. Then, as usual, I always recommend you setting your cut-out template pieces in front of the fan for 5 to 10 minutes so that they can firm up. This is extra important with this template. I would consider this template a slightly more difficult template, an intermediate, let's say an intermediate level of template. You're going to see in a moment why, but the moisture level in your clay here is crucial for how tidy your piece turns out to be. So we're going to start with the lid, and with the side piece, you want to score around the edges, and then you also want to score the long side of the lid. Your template will also show you where exactly you should be scoring here. And then you want to add some slip if you need it. You don't need to add slip. I just added a little bit of water here. It just depends on your clay. And here is the crucial part. So you want to lift up the lid of your pot to attach it to the lid side. But here, you know your moisture level is correct in your clay if it's not sagging too much. Like you can see it's bowed out a little bit on mine here, but like if it's really falling over, that's not what you want. You want your clay to be firm enough here so that it's not going to sag too much while you set it on its side here. This is really important because clay has memory, and you are probably going to struggle later with keeping those edges straight if it's sagging too much here. A little bit is fine. Try and keep it as straight as possible, but yeah, that's what we're going to be looking out for at this stage. And then you just want to repeat it for the other side. Okay, once the 2 sides are attached, we're going to set it aside for now and work on our bottom. So for turning up the bottom edges, what you want to do is score just the corners here, just the part that are cut at a bevel. And then you want to use a ruler here because this is the key to getting sharp edges. So use the ruler to basically like turn up the sides like I'm doing here, and use your thumbs to really push that corner. And then just go around all sides of the dish, turning up each edge one by one, making sure that you blend in those corners so you get a good attachment. Now, when you're moving this, you also want to be sure not to lift it up and like let it flop very much. Try and slide it along and keep the bottom as straight as possible. This is also going to help a lot with warping later on. So now we're back at our lid. I just wanted to set it aside for a moment so that the moisture level could equalize, that the slip could soak in, and it could get a little bit stronger. Now we are going to be blending the edges here, but I'm not focused too much on making it perfect. The blending here is a more structural blend. It's just to get that attachment really well done. I'm going to save tidying it up and making it really look nice for later when it's drier. So once it's well blended, you can just set it aside and we'll deal with the scriggly bits later on. For the handle, I like to use this thick ruler. I'd say it's about a centimeter, maybe 1.5 centimeters thick. You can use whatever, just something round really helps to form that handle. We're going to set it on our lid, make sure it's nice and even, and mark where it's attaching. Score as you would anything else. You can also add some slip here if you like. And then attaching it, you don't want to push directly on, unless your clay has a lot of grog in it. It's probably not going to be strong enough to just push the handle in. So what I did is I turned it up on its side, which allowed me to support the inside that I was pushing into with my other hand. So yeah, I'm turning it so you can see a little bit better here. My hand is supporting the lid so that I'm not like collapsing the lid when I'm pushing the handle into it. And there you go. You can just tidy it up with a paintbrush. I always like to use that to clean up extra scoring marks. You can see I made a few of them here and I'm letting them dry overnight to firm up a little bit under some plastic. You want them to firm up now to leather hard. Now, this is the point that we're going to be tidying things up. I pretty much do this with all of my templates. I always find that when you let things get to leather hard, they just look nicer. They end up crispier. They're just, you know, it definitely pays to be patient with ceramics. So I'm just blending and smoothing, you know, just as much as I want to. You can do it as long as you want. And then you can see how nice they look together. Ta-da! Okay, they're finally ready to be fired. So with bisque, I will fire them together, the two parts of the butter dish. The weight of the lid on the base is going to help keep it flat, but of course for the glaze fire, I will have to fire them separately. So popping them in for the final fire. And here is the final result. So I've got my US butter dish and I've got my European butter dish. And I'm using these terms loosely. I'm sure that there's different styles all over the world. I'm going to add on the screen right now the different sizes of like the interior of the butter dishes, assuming 0.5 centimeter walls and a 10% shrinkage rate, which is what I did here. And then you can measure your butter at home and see if that's going to fit within there. So fun fact, I really wanted to get an American size butter dish so I could show you guys that it would fit, but obviously you can't get those here. So what I did is I had my mom mail me the wax paper so I would be sure to get it correct, and then I just cut down a normal butter to fit there. I thought that was pretty extra. I hope you enjoyed the video. I have the template linked down below, and until next month, bye friends. Well, hey friends, welcome back to another slab template tutorial. Today we're going to be making this cute salt and pepper shaker that also comes with a little tray. Okay, the first thing you need to do once you've cut out your pieces is patch together K8. This is the one long piece. This is going to be the rim around the tray. It was just too long to fit onto a normal size piece of paper. So you've got to use some tape and just patch it together. So as usual, I'm going to be working with a stoneware today and just give it a wedge and roll it out to 1/2 centimeter thickness. Okay, so your clay is ready to cut out your pieces. So what you want to do is cut out K6 twice, K7 and K8 once, and K5 4 times. This is going to make 2 shakers and 1 tray. Next, I like to put it in front of the fan to dry out a little bit. This just helps with constructing my piece. It makes it a little bit more crisp and not so floppy. So I usually leave it in front of the fan for about 5 to 10 minutes. Now that my pieces are a little bit more firm, I can go ahead and start piecing them together. So I'm going to start with the shakers, and you want to start with the rectangular piece and cut each edge at a 45-degree angle, score and slip or use some water as needed depending on your clay, and piece it together. So you want to press those 45-degree angles together so that they're overlapping, and basically the reason we do this is to make an invisible seam. So press them together, get them nice and stuck, and then you'll want to blend it in. And don't forget the inside. Okay, so then you just want to repeat that for the other shaker. So you should have now 2 cylinders. Now we're going to attach the tops and bottoms. So we're going to be using the round pieces, and first you want to place the cylinders on top. You'll notice that the round pieces are definitely a little bit too big for the cylinders. This is intentional because we want to attach them first and then trim them to size. So use your needle tool to mark exactly where the cylinder sits so you can slip and score as needed and attach. Make sure it's really well attached, and then we're going to move on to the other side. So we're going to close the cylinder, and once we have both sides on, that's when we're going to trim the excess clay. So you want to attach this one just like the other one, slip, score, and attach. Now, I like to use a needle tool when removing the clay, and keep in mind the angle of your needle tool because you're going to create an angle here. If you want to have a perfectly straight line, just hold your needle tool straight up and down like I'm doing. You could also bevel the edge by holding your needle tool at an edge. And then, of course, you want to blend. Repeat for the other side so that you have a closed cylinder. And then you can set that one aside for now because we're going to be doing the same exact thing to the other shaker. Okay, now that our shakers are formed, we're going to move on to the tray. Don't worry, we're going to be adding holes later. I will show you why. We're going to leave that for later in a second. So you want to start with the rim and once again cut the edges at a 45-degree angle. If you don't have this tool, you can just use a needle tool or a knife to cut the 45-degree angle and then slip and score and attach. Next, we're going to put it on the base. So you want to line it up, and I like to use the shakers to kind of gauge the shape that I'm trying to make. And once again, you'll notice the bottom is too big. That's intentional. So you want to mark where it's going to sit, score both sides, and attach just like we always do. And I like to use a paintbrush to kind of clean up the extra scoring lines. And trim the edge and blend it in. And then a rib is really handy here to kind of clean up that line. Okay, so now that we have the main pieces assembled, we're going to set it aside. So this project works way better if you let the pieces harden up a little bit before you do all of the details. It's just going to leave you with cleaner lines and tidier seams. So what I like to do is leave it under a piece of cloth for overnight, and then the next day I'll go back in and finish things up. So with the tray, I'm basically just smoothing it out. I'm also like using my rib here to scrape a little bit of the extra clay off and try and get like a really sharp edge to this tray. But of course you just do this until you're happy with it. There's nothing wrong with a little bit of an organic look. Ta-da! Now we're going to set that aside to dry completely and move on to the shakers. So first I want to cut the hole for the cork. This is how you can get the salt or pepper into the shaker. You absolutely need to include this part. And what you want to look for is some sort of tapered cork. So whether this is from a wine bottle or oil, or you can also often just buy corks from your pottery supplier. This is where I got these ones from. But it's really important that it's a tapered cork because you want to line up the wider end, and this is going to be the shape that you cut out. You need to account for shrinkage here. So I find that if you just use the wide end, because of shrinkage, it ends up somewhere in between and the cork sits really nice. So I just traced the wide end on, and I'm going to be using my X-Acto knife to cut out that circle. Next, we want to cut the holes where the salt can actually come out. So I'm using here a 3mm drill bit, or 1/8 of an inch. And I find that this is the right size for my clay shrinkage, but you might need to experiment a little bit with your clay to find the exact right size. And you can see I'm testing the cork here. Basically, it should look like this. It should look really loose, like you could just pop the cork through. That's where we want the size to be. Now we just set it to dry. I usually wait about a week until my pots are completely dry. Then I'm going to load them into the bisque kiln. I'm firing at 900 degrees Celsius. I'm using a white glaze here. And in case the holes where the salt comes out gets sealed, you'll definitely want to poke that out again with the needle tool, because otherwise they definitely will seal. And here's our final result. I think these salt shakers are so cute. They're very minimalistic, but very chic at the same time. And I think the cork adds a really cute little quirky element to them. And they also work really nice. So happy making. I hope that you guys love this template, and let me know what you think down below in the comments. See you next time. Hey friends, welcome back to another pottery tutorial. Today we're going to cover a much requested one and a template that took me quite a long time to organize. This is the egg tray. So we have two different versions of the egg tray. We have an egg tray for 6 eggs and one for 12 eggs. First, I'm going to show you how to make the 6 egg one. So first you want to roll out a 1 centimeter slab, and with all of the slabs here today, I do recommend letting them dry out a little bit. So you can either sandwich them between boards and let them dry out overnight if your studio is not overly dry, or just let them sit for an hour or two. You want to cut out ET1 twice and ET2 once. If you have a bigger slab, you can cut them all out of the same slab. I just ran out of room in my slab, so I'm using another piece. And then before moving on, you also want to trace through your template pieces all of the solid lines. So these are parts that we're going to be scoring or cutting out later. You want to trace through so you can properly assemble your template. Okay, now we're moving on to the 1/2 centimeter slab. So for this one, you want to cut out E4 twice. If you do have room, you can also make this out of the 1 centimeter slab, but I find that makes the tray a little bit heavy. Okay, now we're going to start assembling. So you want to flip over your E2 template to the opposite side of where you drew on your circles, the egg holes. And along the lines where on the ET2 template it says to score, you want to score there. First, we're going to be attaching the 1/2 centimeter slab supports. So just score along the edges and attach them. Because I let my slabs dry out a little bit, I am going to be using a little bit of water to help them stick. If you're using fresh clay, this is probably not necessary. And then just make sure you line it up right to the edge and press down gently but firmly. You can blend this in a bit now. Don't worry too much about making it perfect yet, because I would wait until the end when it's more stable. Where we marked it, you can see the score here marks. We're going to score that as well. That's where the sides are going to attach. At this point, it should be stable enough to stand on its own, so then you can attach the final piece. If your clay is a little on the wet side, like mine was here, you might find that the tray is bowing a little bit. In that case, just use a sponge or some sort of soft support. You could use a cloth or something to just gently push it up from the inside. Okay, now we're moving on to the 12 egg tray. So you want to use ET1, ET3, and ET5 for this project. And then this is a rather large template, so you need to paste together the two sides of ET3 and ET5. Then once again, we're going to use a 1 centimeter slab of clay here to cut out the entirety of ET3. Trace through all of those egg hole cutouts. And then we're going to use a 1 centimeter slab of clay here to cut out 2 ET1s. The rest of our 1/2 centimeter slab, we can cut out ET5 twice. And again, if you just want to use 1 centimeter slabs here, you can. I just find that using a 1/2 centimeter slab here makes the whole egg tray a little bit lighter, a little bit nicer to handle. Okay, and then you want to score along the edges of ET3 where it's marked score here. This is going to be where we attach the 1/2 centimeter supports. So score along the edge. I'm using a little bit of water here to help it attach since my slabs are a bit dried out. And then just press down. Okay, now we are going to score along those lines that are marked score here on your template. Flip over your egg tray and attach it to the side. These lines should match up. Don't worry right now about blending everything perfectly. We're going to wait until our piece is a bit more firmed up before we make everything nice and clean. Okay, now we are going to set our egg trays aside overnight so it can dry until it's leather hard. How long you have to wait until it's leather hard really just depends on the climate in your studio. If it's very dry, if it's very warm, it'll dry faster. I work in a basement, so it's cool and damp, so overnight works just fine for me. Okay, it's the next day now, and we're going to tidy up and cut out all of our egg holes today. So you can see I'm using my rib to sort of scrape off any extra clay, try and make those lines as smooth as possible, and bevel the edges as well. So you can just keep doing this until you're happy with the piece. There's really no right or wrong here. Once our piece is nice and smooth, it's time to cut out all of our egg holes. I find this part to be a little bit tedious, but just go in ideally with an X-Acto knife to cut out those holes as precisely as you can, and then I just like to use my finger to smooth it out. After you cut out your egg holes, I didn't show this in the video demonstration, but after you cut out your egg holes, if you want to, you can also use the egg tray side cutout guide. That's a piece that's included in your templates to cut out a little handle on the sides of the egg trays. So you do this exactly the same way that you cut out the egg holes at the same leather hard status. And I'm just repeating all those steps for the 12 egg tray. My 12 egg tray barely fit into my kiln. I had to remove the bottom shelf and just biscuit straight on the kiln floor, but it did fit. This piece is about 40 centimeters long, fully assembled. So make sure you have kiln space for that. As usual, I'm just using a very simple white glaze over my templates, and I find it easiest to dip them sort of like half and half. And once again, my 12 egg tray was a little bit too long to fit into my glaze bucket, so I just went back in later with a paintbrush to patch up those unglazed bits. It's gonna be fine. And then for wiping the bottom, you just need to wipe the parts of the egg tray that touch the table when it sits on it. So the parts that would attach to the kiln shelf, you just need to wipe those off. And here's our final result. We have 2 egg trays. Whether you've got a carton of eggs that's a dozen or 6 pieces only, you've got all the options here. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you enjoyed this template, and I'll see you next month for a new one. Bye, friends. Hey friends, welcome back to another pottery template. Today we are going to be making this very cool citrus press or lemon squeezer or whatever you want to call it. Something that squeezes your citrus. So first thing you need to do is tape together the two parts of K17. This piece was just too long to include on a normal sheet of paper, so I just put it into parts and just use some tape to tape it together. Then, of course, we need to roll out some clay. So I'm going to be using about 1 kilo of clay here that I'm rolling out. However, please note that I'm not actually using all of that in this project. It's just the amount that you want to grab from your clay to roll out a slab. So you're going to be able to reuse at least half of this. Now I'm going to be using stoneware for this project, but of course you can use any clay you like. Just please make sure that it is a food-safe clay, so air-dry clay or polymer clay is not going to work for this project. So I'm rolling out a 1/2 centimeter here, and you're going to want to make it a little bit on the long side, like long and narrow, like you can see I'm doing here, so it can fit this long K17 piece. But of course, if you need to roll it out in pieces, that's also perfectly fine. So then you just want to cut out one of each template. Now, as usual, I like to let my template cutouts dry a little bit in front of the fan before I start working with them. I usually let them dry here for 5 to 10 minutes. This makes them a little bit more firm, which I find easier to work this. So I'm going to start with the cone piece, and here you want to cut both of the flat ends at a 45-degree angle. So make sure you're flipping it halfway in between so that the two angles are able to overlap. And you want to, of course, score the pieces that you're going to attach and use slip if necessary. My clay was wet enough so that I didn't need to use slip here, but that does depend on your clay. So just overlap them and try and smoothen that seam as best you can. I was having a little hard time showing you guys this holding my hands in the right way, but hopefully you get the picture. And then make sure also you want to smooth out the inside too, because this part is going to be exposed as well. Okay, now we can set that aside for now, and we're going to work on the rim. So that's the long, thin piece. And once again, cut at a 45-degree angle and score each side so that they are able to overlap and create a nice invisible seam. Just go ahead and blend. Okay, now we are going to attach the rim here to the base. Now you'll notice with this template, like all of my templates, the base is a little bit bigger than it needs to be. That is because the easiest way to get the nicest connection is to attach first and then trim to size. So you want to mark with your needle tool where you're going to attach it, score those lines, and then just attach it. Be careful to use light but even pressure here to not buckle the walls. And then I like to go back in with some water on a paintbrush to smooth out any extra scoring lines. Once it's well attached, that's when I will cut off the extra and blend the base up into the walls. I'm not too worried about making it perfect just now because I know I'm going to go back in later and smooth everything out. Now we want to add our cone, so you want to try and center it as much as possible. And once again, you're going to just draw around it with your needle tool to mark where it's attaching. And then, use your scoring tool to score both sides. Do use slip if your clay wants you to use slip. And then just give it some nice, soft, light but firm pressure. And try and get your finger in there and blend that seam out. We want as few cracks as possible to make this food safe. Okay, and then if you want to, you can add a spout here now. I recommend you do this now and not later in the build because right now the clay is very wet and easy to manipulate. Later on, you might risk a crack here if you try and do what I'm doing here. And then for a citrus press, I don't like the cone to be very sharp. So what I like to do is use a rib to kind of pat down that cone a little bit and round it out a little bit more. And this is going to make it more of a soft curve instead of a sharp edge. It just works out better that way. I also made another piece that doesn't have a spout, and later I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with that. So now you want to let them dry out a little bit. So what I like to do is put some cloth over them and let them dry out overnight. This way, they're going to be leather hard the next time I get to them. But drying times depends on your region, you know, the weather and the state of your studio. So now I'll go back in and really clean up that edge there. So if it's dry enough, you can use the rib like I'm using here to kind of shave off the extra clay. Otherwise, just do what you normally do, blending it in with your finger. So once that's nice, I'm going to actually carve out the bottom because you'll notice there's actually some trapped air in here, which is not what we want. We want all of our pieces to be accessible, especially since this is going to be used for food. We want to make sure that everything can get cleaned very easily. So I just cut out the bottom and I'm going to smooth out that seam. Next, it's time to carve the grooves. So for that, I'm using a little loop tool, and you can carve the grooves out any pattern you like. I chose to do 4 around each side and then like lower grooves later on. I think that you can see what I mean better than I can explain it. But you do want to cut some nice grooves in here because that's what's going to catch the juice out of the citrus. So now that piece is done, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do on this other one that doesn't have a spout. So this is a little experiment of mine, and I'm going to let you know at the end how it turns out. But I wanted something to capture the seeds in the citrus. So I'm using a 1/2 centimeter drill bit to basically make a little sieve on the side of my citrus press. And I'm hoping that that's going to catch all the seeds and all the pulp and just let out the juice. But we're going to test it at the end and see how it goes. Okay, and then you just need to let them dry out. So once they're bone dry, I'm going to pop them into the bisque kiln. And here I'm glazing my citrus press. Make sure you remove the glaze from the bottom and then back into the kiln for the final fire. And here is our final results. So this is the press that has the built-in sieve. And I just think that this is such a cool shape, a cool form. It's such a kitchen essential. It's just so practical. I don't know about you guys, but I use a lot of lemons in my cooking. And I just think that this is going to make the whole process a lot easier. I used to squeeze them by hand and then run it through a sieve. And I've been using this press the last few weeks, and it works really well. So yeah, let's test out the sieve. Ta-da! One thing I learned, I might actually remake this because the holes should be a little bit higher than I made them. Like if you're squeezing a particularly juicy lemon, sometimes the holes have been too low and then the juice just spills out onto my counter. So if you're gonna make this, definitely put the holes a little bit higher than I did. But of course, the standard, I think this is how most citrus presses are designed, the standard lip works just fine. And then if you don't have any seeds, or if you don't mind seeds, you can just pour it right in, or you can use a sieve to sieve out the pulp. And that's all. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. You can find the templates down below, and I've got loads more templates on my channel, so definitely check those out, and I'll see you guys next month with the next template. Bye, friends. Well, hey friends, welcome back to another pottery template tutorial. So today we are making a long requested project. This is the butter bell. Another name for it is a French butter dish. So the first thing you need to do is tape your two template pieces together. So B1 and B2 both have two little indicators that say attached here. You want to attach them at that point. We're going to roll out a 1/2 centimeter slab. And with this 1/2 centimeter slab, you want to cut out each template piece once. I actually just ran out of room for B4 on here, so I'm gonna just roll out one additional slab for that. So you see here, I'm using the scraps to make another 1/2 centimeter slab for B4. Set those aside, and now I'm going to roll out a 1 centimeter slab. This is going to be the lid, and I personally like to make the lid a little bit thicker. That's why I'm making it 1 centimeter here. Making it thicker is not completely required, but I personally like it. And then I'm going to go ahead and put these pieces in front of the fan. So if you don't have a fan, you do want to let them dry out for about an hour, but with a fan, I can reduce that to about 15 minutes. So you see that there are 3 diagonal pieces here. These are all going to be assembled into cylinders, and they're all done the exact same way. The smallest one is going to be the handle, the medium one is going to be the lid, and the largest one is going to be the base. So I like to cut my edges at a 45-degree angle so that they overlap. We're going to start by assembling the lid. So you want to take the middle cylinder and then score, and if you need to, you can add a little bit of slip or water, or just stick them together at that point. So you want to take the middle cylinder, which is B2, and position it in the middle of the 1 centimeter B4 piece. So the thicker circle piece. Position it there, mark it, score, and attach these two pieces together. Do your best to make sure this piece is as round as possible. For all of these steps, the more perfectly round you can make it, the better it will fit into the base later on. The next step is we need to trim the lid to size. So I'm using the larger of the cylinders. This is actually the base. And before I connect the base, I'm going to use that to position it so it's perfectly spaced around the inner cylinder, mark it, and cut it to size. This is going to guarantee that the inner cylinder and the outer cylinder are evenly spaced. Okay, now you can remove the larger cylinder, the base, and we're going to actually attach it now to make the bottom of our butter bell. So I'm positioning it as round as possible on the last round piece and attaching these pieces together. Once they're attached, I can go ahead and trim the excess and blend it together. If you're finding that the middle of the lid is sagging a little bit, that can be that your clay is not quite dry enough. My clay was a little bit wet to attach the handle here, so I wanted to support it. So I found a small pot that was about the right width to support the center of the lid as I attach the handle. You want to be careful if you're experiencing any sagging here, because by pushing the handle into the pot at this point, you can just like cave in the lid and distort it quite severely. So that's why I'm putting it on a pot here. And I recommend that because that really helped to support the lid from caving in. And now, while the piece is still quite wet, I'm going to start bending the handle outward. I really recommend doing this because not only does it add a really nice curved element to it, but also it's going to create a more stable base for when you're using the butter bell. So don't forget, you're often going to be turning the lid over and you want it to rest securely while you're scooping out the butter. Now, before I finish refining these pieces, I like to let my pottery dry to leather hard. So I'm just going to let it dry overnight under some cloth. Now that my pieces are leather hard, I can go ahead and refine the edges. So I'm gonna use my fingers and a sponge, maybe a rib, to just make sure all the edges are nice and cleaned up. There's no sharp points, everything is nice and clean and tidy. And then you can just set them aside to dry until they're ready to go into the kiln. For the bisque kiln, I do recommend firing them together. This is going to help them to not warp away from each other, but rather, if they do warp, warp together. Then I'll just pop them in the glaze and put them back into the fire. So for the glaze fire, I do recommend actually firing them separate at this point, and this has to do entirely with how you're going to wipe it. So for this one, I want to wipe just the bottom of the base and the part that touches the bottom of the lid. So just that little ring, I'm going to remove the glaze from, and then I'm going to fire them separately. If you want to fire them together, you can do this, but you're going to have to remove not only the bottom of the base, but also whatever parts of the butter balls that are touching each other, because otherwise the glaze will fuse, right? So the easiest is to just fire them separately. And that's it. Here's our butter ball. This is so cute. I'm so glad that I finally got around to making this project. This one's a little complicated to design because it does have these two pieces that are fitting together, but I really recommend for this just making sure your circles are as round as they possibly can be. That's going to make it as easy as possible. I also recommend letting your butter come to room temperature before putting it in here. I didn't do that and I really struggled to get the butter in. And then how a butter bell works is you just put a little bit of water into the base, and that stops any oxygen from coming in contact with your butter, and it's going to help your butter stay fresh for a long time. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, friends. Okay, friends, welcome back. Today we are making a sponge holder, and that is somewhere where you can dry out your sponge after you're using it for washing dishes or whatever you're using your sponge for. So the first thing you need to do is cut out the templates, and then the K4 template needs to be pieced together because this piece was too long to print on one page of paper. So you just need to use some tape and connect them together. I want to remind you guys to print at 100% scale if you want your templates to be the same size that mine are in this video. That is a setting that you can usually find when you're printing out the templates. But of course, like all my templates, you can size them up or down to fit whatever sponge you want. So as usual, I'm using 0.5 centimeter thickness gauges to roll out my clay, and then I'll compress it with a rib. Then you just want to lay down your templates and cut them out. So you're going to want to cut out one piece of K1 and K4, and then 2 pieces of K2, and the last piece, K3, that's actually just a guide, so you don't need to cut out any shapes for K3. And then, as usual, I like to put my cutout pieces in front of the fan to dry out a little bit. This just makes them a little easier to work with. They're not quite as floppy as they otherwise would be, but this very much depends on your clay, so you might be able to skip the fan step. Okay, we're going to start with the long piece. This is going to be the foot, and we just need to piece it together in a circle for the beginning. So I'm using my tool to cut a 45-degree angle. If you don't have this tool, you can just use a knife, and then you need to score each edge. If you need to use some slip here, you can. I'm just using a little bit of water to piece them together. And then you want to go ahead and blend them right away. Okay, moving on to the main body of the piece. So here's where we're going to be using our guide. And I'm just marking along here because this is going to help us know where to put the foot. So this is the guide for where to put the foot, basically, so you can get it nice and centered. And just, place it in there as best as you can, as evenly as you can. And then I'm marking it once again because it's not exactly where the guide is, and that's fine. So I marked it again so I know exactly where to score. And I'll score both sides as per usual, add a little bit of water or slip if you need it, and attach. Okay, so the next step, we need to give this base a little bit of curve. So I'm using my hands to just press that inward a little bit. I want to make it curve in a little bit, nice and evenly, keeping an eye on the foot that you're not distorting the foot. And then I'm also going to use my fingers to turn the edges, these edges right here, into sort of like a spout shape. Now this is totally optional, but I thought it would be a nice little touch so you can empty the dish and you can just pour the water off the end like that. Now I'm cleaning up any extra scoring lines here and using my paintbrush to smooth it out. Okay, and then we're going to move on to the sponge supports. So in order for them to fit on this curved surface now, you actually need to bend them a little bit here. So just bend it just a little bit like I did and hold it in place. And then you can use your needle tool to mark exactly where it needs to go, where you can do your slipping and your scoring. Now, because we are putting a basically 45-degree angle here, you need to be quite firm with the pressure that you're putting here. Just make sure it's really nicely attached here. If you're finding that your clay is too floppy and it's not working, it's not sticking up straight, that means it needs to dry out a little bit more. So just pop that in front of the fan for a little while. If you live in a very humid place or you're working in a very humid environment, you might cut out these pieces and leave them for next day. Just depends on the dryness of where you are working. Okay, and you see here, I'm also like flaying them out a little bit. I think that that's nice just to make it easier to get the sponge in. So they're curved a little bit towards the outside and just splayed out just a tiny little bit. Next, we're going to let our sponge holder firm up overnight before I go back in and clean up all the edges. You'll notice that the edges are a little bit rough still. I like to save those for the next day. I think that's way easier when all of my attachments are nice and firm. Yeah, so I just leave them under cloth overnight. Next day, we're just gonna tidy things up. Now, depending on your sink situation, if you want your sponge holder to drain, like if the sponge holder is gonna live in the sink or somewhere on the sink that will drain into the sink, you might wanna poke some holes here, just like a soap dish, you might want it to drain. Just depends on your situation. So I decided to try that out on one of my pieces to see how that would work out. Okay, now we're just going to let them dry out. I'm going to fire them and glaze them. And here's the final result.